Hello, welcome back, That's Allowed listeners. I'm Jonathan McLatchie, and I will be co-hosting the podcast today. We are still in the lockdown resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, and so I'm joining today from Boston in Massachusetts in the United States.
Wow,
welcome.
That's masterful, yeah.
Welcome, Jonathan. There's no coincidence that you're here today, and that will be relevant a bit later.
Clearly a complete professional. You're going to put us to shame.
It's been designed well.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, how else will people know you, Jonathan?
So I have a YouTube channel called Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. That's the name of the channel. I also have another channel called Apologetics Academy, which are a series of recordings of webinars that I run. People can also find the website of that. It's apologetics-academy.org. And essentially, I run webinars regularly, bringing on different scholars and thinkers, scientists, philosophers from across the theological and philosophical spectrum, and typically they give a presentation of up to an hour and then take open floor Q&A, discussion and dialogue and debate. And I also counsel Christians to wrestle with intellectual doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith. I've also been involved in a number of debates. I've done more than 40 debates with people of different perspectives on religion and faith, including atheists and Muslims and Jews and so forth.
Yeah, you'll be really familiar to Unbelievable listeners. How many times have you been on?
I've been on, I believe, about 10 times now.
Oh, wow. More than us combined.
Yeah.
Yes, puts my pitiful twice into perspective.
And my 4 times, and Ed's 4 times.
About 4, I think.
Yeah, oh, right. We may have 10 between us then.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah. Now, the thing about Jonathan...
That's a coincidence.
Yes, right there.
Yeah. The thing about Jonathan is he is a scientist in biology, did his PhD at Newcastle, and that's why you're in Boston, isn't it? You're a teaching professor there now.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And you sort of came to prominence as someone who's really in on the science side of things, advocating something. Would you call it idea itself, intelligent design?
Yeah, I'm an advocate of the scientific theory of intelligent design, which is basically the idea that there are certain patterns in nature which are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than a stochastic, unguided process of chance and necessity.
Yeah. So if people Google intelligent design and your name, they'll get a lot of material. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. We'll certainly put Apologetics Academy links in the show notes, and the YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's all right. I'll carry on talking. We welcome Jonathan. Actually, this story started when you were absolutely treated abysmally on the atheist experience back in September or something.
Oh, I think I've seen that. Yeah.
And I was listening away. And I thought, you've got some interesting stuff here on the resurrection that they didn't let you even begin to present. And I asked, next time you're in London, how about talking to our London discussion group that's sort of allied to Unbelievable. And you were great. And so it was in January you came. And what surprised me was the way you thought that the minimal facts needed a bit more maximizing. The minimal facts on their own were not going to enough evidence to confirm a resurrection, and the reliability of the Gospels was going to be a key step in establishing that. And then you gave a lot of, probably maybe half the talk or even more, on undesigned coincidences, which is going to be the topic of our discussion today. So we thought, great. I mean, this is something we're beginning to hear about, and we'll explain what we're talking about soon. And who better than Jonathan to be on our show to sort of talk us through it all?
Exactly. I remember giving you some pushback on a couple of things at that meeting. Jonathan, you probably don't. We probably had so many other meetings and engagements, probably don't remember. But anyway, today is the bit of a British nice pushback in Justin-Brierly style from Unbelievable.
Yeah, we'll try and keep it all
But and try and explain it. So I suppose the best thing to do now is to say, for anyone who's listening, to say, what is an undesigned coincidence and what does it have to do with the Bible? Jonathan, take it away and explain that, what that means, basically.
Absolutely. Well, so basically, sometimes you have two or more works by different authors, and they interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other, or both were copied from a common source. For example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question that's raised by the other. And so the two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, there are examples of these between the Gospels that we find in the New Testament themselves, and also between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul, and also between the epistles, between different letters within the Pauline corpus. And there were also examples between the Gospels, Acts, and external secular sources as well. William Paley was the individual, he's a Christian philosopher who first coined the term undesigned coincidences, and he was the first to pioneer this argument. And you might be more acquainted with William Paley for his watchmaker thesis, where you find the watch on the heath and you infer from the intricacy of the inner workings of the various components that it was a product of design. And he's most famous for that, which he published in his volume Natural Theology. But he also wrote other works, including Hori Pollinae, and another book called A View of the Evidence of Christianity. And in his Hori Pollinae, which is translated from the Latin, means the times of Paul, he sets forth this argument of what he calls undesignedness, which is this pattern between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul, which point both to the authenticity of the Pauline corpus and also to the substantial veracity of the book of Acts. And so he writes, and I quote, he says, "In examining, therefore, the agreement between ancient writings, the character of truth and originality is undesignedness. And this test applies to every supposition, for whether we suppose the history to be true but the letters spurious, or the letters to be genuine but the history false, or lastly, falsehood to belong to both, the history to be a fable, and the letters fictitious, the same inference will result, that either there will be no agreement between them, or the agreement will be the effect of design. Nor will it elude the principle of this rule to suppose the same person to have been the author of all the letters, or even the author both of the letters and the history. For no less design is necessary to produce coincidence between different parts of a man's own writings, especially when they are made to take different forms of history and of original letters, than to adjust them to the circumstances found in any other writing." So he had in mind there in particular the examples between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. But I think for the purpose of our discussion today, we want to focus more on the Gospels.
Yeah. So when did Paley write this?
This was written in, I think, early 1700s. Let me get the exact date for.
Yeah, it was 17.
I think I've seen 1780 or something, but
yeah, I thought it was 1790, but
late 1700s.
Late 1700s. Yeah. So
okay.
One of the things. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we use Lydia McGrew's example in the coffee shop as a sort of what this sort of thing might mean in a unconventional setting, uncontroversial setting?
Sure. Do you want me to go through that example, or do you want to go through it?
Well, I mine will be about fourth hand because I read John Nelson's blog on this, and that's how I know about it.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. So basically, this is an illustration that Lydia gives in her book, Hidden in Plain View, where you imagine that two individuals meet together in a coffee shop, and they're discussing they're discussing something that took place, and there's one of the individuals reports back to their boss or their colleague about this conversation that took place. Maybe the other person confessed that they'd been involved in some sort of misdemeanor or crime or something, and the other person, of course, denies that this conversation even took place. And so the question is, okay, so let's say there's two eyewitness reports to this conversation, and there's and you're wanting to discover, okay, so did this conversation actually take place, or is it something that is being that's being made up by the participants? And so you examine one of the eyewitness accounts, and one says that it was extremely busy and crowded in the coffee shop, and it was really difficult for them to find a seat. And there's another eyewitness account which doesn't mention that it was busy and it was difficult for them to find a seat, but the other mentions in passing that they got bumped, and so they spilt the coffee all over their lap, and it was really embarrassing, and so forth. So the eyewitness account, which mentions that they were bumped and spilled the coffee, cries out for some sort of explanation, which is supplied quite incidentally and quite in passing, quite casually, by the other account, which is which mentions the busyness of the place, and so it was very crowded, and so that explains or illuminates what would give occasion to this person being bumped and them spilling the coffee all over their lap. So the two accounts then fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and suggest indeed this is an event that's grounded in real events that took place. Yeah,
so I like that one because it gets us a feel of what's actually going on here. It sort of nudges us in the direction of the accounts being true and honest, but it's not a proof of anything. It's just sort of evidence to throw in the pot along with other things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So let me just clarify before we go further that I'm not claiming that undesigned coincidences provide a rigorous proof of the events in question. I'm arguing that they supply some evidence for them. So in other words, there are more that sort of evidence is more probable on the hypothesis of historicism than on other hypotheses. I'm not saying that there are other hypotheses to explain such connections are impossible. I'm saying that the most probable scenario in this case is that they are grounded in truth. Indeed, it's the simplest explanation, I would argue.
Perfect. Lovely.
I would like to come in here and step back to the bigger principle. When I first discovered this particular approach, I immediately had red lights going off straight away because I've studied a lot of scholarship and been aware of all kinds of different things. And I immediately thought, well, if this is new, this is interesting. I then realized it wasn't. It was coming from Paley and Blunt, and they'd done their
Blunt?
work. J.J. Blunt.
Carry on.
A guy that sort of picked up, I think, probably 1849, a lot of this material from Paley. And this was at the time when I realized
I thought you were going to pick up that he applied it to the Gospels. Isn't that the thing about
no, he was doing the Gospels and the Old Testament. So he had stacks.
So he did it much more widely.
Yeah.
Paley concentrated on Acts and Paul.
That's right. And Blunt was more the Gospels and a bit more, I think, and also loads of stuff from the Old Testament. So the whole thing was a whole. And I realized then, I thought, oh my gosh, this is all before the masses and masses and masses of studies in the Gospel synoptic relationship between Mark and Luke and Matthew and John were getting going, before people had really done masses of work on their interrelationship and copying from each other and redaction and all of that. And I'm thinking, oh, there's a huge red light there straight away for me. And because it's like, that's very, very fine for someone back then who probably didn't have the focus or even knowledge of what others were doing in the field, and they're making this case. And I then discovered, and that was a thought that came to me, I thought naturally. I didn't read that anywhere. I just, that's always a good thing that I think when I'm doing something myself, is that it's not that I've read, oh, well, so-and-so critiques it like this. I immediately thought, well, that's a red light for me. Because once I saw that the case for Blunt would be better, from his point of view, he's making a better case than Lydia is, because Lydia is doing it in a very different position, but post a lot of this synoptic studies and everything else. And as a matter of fact, in her book, she basically, and John Nelson picks that up, she basically quotes, or a quote of hers is basically, this approach is setting aside the apparatus of critical scholarship, something along those lines, whereas Blunt wasn't. So
I think you're jumping on a little bit.
Right. Well, no, okay.
Well, what I'm thinking is you're saying that it sort of died a death in the 20th century as an argument because of the scholarship.
19th.
Well, it flourished in the 19th, and then by the early 20th, mid 20th century, no one was talking about it.
I think earlier than that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think by the end of the 19th century, it really gone based on the studies of everyone else who were just looking the other way. I'd be interested to hear back from Jonathan if he agrees with that analysis of why it died a bit.
So far, we've only heard an assertion that it floundered in view of the 20th century scholarship. I'd be interested to hear what scholarship exactly he thinks refutes undesigned coincidences. I mean, maybe we should actually give one or two examples so people are actually acquainted with the basic argument, and then hear what rebuttals you guys think.
Well, hang around though. I think what I wanted to do was having watched a lot of your videos on this. I think it would be. I wanted give an example, but I wanted to say a couple of things and ask you some point blank questions first, because what I have felt has been the weakness on the video is that if I was a teenage sort of fundamentalist Christian and I watched one of your videos, I would think, oh, wow, this is amazing. But if you had only said a few things before, later in life, I would have thought, well, that was really good of you, to say that. So, for example, I heard you just on the other day on 1 Minute Apologist said, when you have the independent stories or something going on, and immediately I thought, well, okay, so what are you going to say about the relationship of the gospel? So if I could put to you, Jonathan, what do you, whereas Blunt may not have thought this, and certainly Paley may not have thought this, do you think that Matthew copied large sections or 600 words, of 600, of his verses into Matthew's gospel, that Matthew actually copied verbatim certain chunks?
Yeah, I'm fairly non-committal on exactly the order of the gospel. Certainly the consensus view is Markian priority. There are some scholars, a minority of scholars like David Black and others who have urged for a Matthean priority, or there's different versions of that. I'm perfectly happy for the sake of argument to go with Markian priority as the consensus, and I think you can make a good argument for it. So I'm happy to go with that. And certainly there is a literary dependence between the three synoptic gospels at least. And there's also there's much debate as to the extent to which John had access to or utilized the synoptics in constructing his own narratives. That's something that's highly contested or debated in scholarship. The synoptic gospels, there's the widely known synoptic problem, what I prefer to call the synoptic puzzle. And there's various views on that. Probably the consensus view currently is the idea that is what's called the two source hypothesis, where Matthew and Luke are utilizing Mark, except in areas where Matthew and Luke agree with each other but differ from Mark's account, in which case probably the majority of scholars would invoke the hypothetical Q source, which comes from the German word Quelle, meaning a source, which is the source that's thought to be common to Matthew and Luke that's independent of Mark. So that is I'm happy to go with those for the sake of argument. I'm fairly skeptical of Q, and there are a number of scholars such as Richard Goodacre, who's the author of The Case Against Q, who questions the existence of Q. Certainly there's no documentary or manuscript evidence for it, and there's no sources referring to it. It's only a conjectural idea. But certainly there's a relationship between the synoptic gospels, and probably Matthew and Luke are drawing upon Mark.
So would you then agree that it's a slightly harder, it would be a wonderful thing, Undesigned Coincidences, if all four gospels were like independent, not knowing each other and relating a coincidence, compared with the idea that Matthew was copying Mark, that Luke was copying possibly both, that John in fact knew all three in modern studies? Do you think that in itself is a fair thing to tell your audience before you actually start making it? Because it would it'd be fantastic if we could see that the gospels had nothing to do with each other. This would be one major heck of an argument, but once you start redacting like a play script and changing it, and can I press you a bit more on that then? Do you think that Matthew, like majority of scholars that I know, even evangelicals, would say that Matthew changed what he read in Mark for his own theological purposes, that he relocated things, changed the locations, the order of things to adapt? Or do you think, because that is so different from eyewitness testimony, do you agree with that at the same time? Or would you then say, well, that's not true?
No, I don't think it is. I think that Matthew had his own access to his own sources of information. And so I don't think that Matthew, or any of the Gospels for that matter, are deliberately changing their sources in order to make theological points.
Right.
That's not a view I would subscribe to.
And you would agree that a majority of people do say that, though?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's all.
Can I just say, as the sort of resident
What? Francis,
Quite, you may well ask. Yeah, actually, I didn't have my microphone plugged in, so I don't know if you heard any of my earlier comments. But anyway, I've got my microphone plugged in now. Yes, I was just going to say, as your kind of resident layperson on this subject, I think it might be time to give us at least one example, so that people can get a handle on it, because I think it's quite academic, and some people will be familiar with it, but for those who aren't, I think it's all being discussed a bit in like up in the air, and perhaps we need to bring it a bit more down to the text.
Sure.
I hope that doesn't
that's where we were
irreparable
going.
hole as in what was the plan for the. Okay, good.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Go on then, John.
So I believe that you wanted to focus in particular on the feeding of the 5,000 narratives. So let's take one example from that and back to undesigned coincidences. And of course, there are various. There are several dozen examples of undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, and I would argue that they have different levels of strength, and there are different forms that an undesigned coincidence might take as well. Here's an example from the feeding of the 5,000 narrative. This is the Gospel of John, chapter 6 and verse 5, which says, "Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that this people may eat?'" Now, this raises an immediate question in the mind of the audience. Why does Jesus turn to Philip here, in particular, on this occasion? Then we continue reading just a few verses later to verse 8 and 9. It says, "One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are they for so many?'" And so the question again arises, why does Andrew get involved in the reply here? Well, we go over to the Gospel of Luke in chapter number 9, which also sets up the feeding of the 5,000 miracles. So this is the parallel account in the Gospel of Luke. It says, "On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing." So here we learn in passing that the event took place in the town of Bethsaida. Now, if we go over to the Gospel of John again, this is chapter 12 now, so 6 chapters later, after the feeding of the 5,000 has been reported, in a completely different context, unrelated to the feeding of the 5,000, it says, chapter 12, verse 21, "So these came," so speaking about Greeks who were at the feast of Passover, and they want to see Jesus, and so they come to Philip to ask him if they can speak to Jesus. And it says, "They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.'" And so then we also learn from the book of John, chapter 1, verse 44, that Bethsaida is also the city of Andrew and Peter. And so when we put the pieces together, Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. He just mentions Jesus speaking to the disciples. And John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story, which is a detail you find only in Luke. And Luke also doesn't mention Andrew getting involved in the reply, which is in John as well. So only by putting them together, that is John 6 with John 12 with Luke 9, can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5 and why Andrew gets involved in the reply as well. Because Philip and Andrew are both from the town of Bethsaida, and they're local people who know where the shops are to buy bread. And so that's never spelled out for you, for the reader in the text. You have to do the detective work of looking at John 6 coupled with John 12 and John 1 and Luke 9, put the pieces together to form this full, complete picture of why Jesus turns to Philip. And that's the sort of pattern which I think is best explained on the hypothesis of truth. It has this hallmark, I would argue, of verisimilitude, that it is not conclusive proof, but it is, I think, very suggestive of truth in this particular detail.
Right. This is where I wanted to do a bit of pushback. This is one of the very beginning things that when I first, a lot of stuff just came to me from other stuff that I'd studied. And I would have to say in the nicest possible way that all of that, what you just said, is really evidence, I would say, for a mistrial on the whole thing, because there were so many factors that all come against everything about what you just said, that it's just almost, to me, it's like a cumulative case. This is why I wanted to focus on this one particular one, because I know there's lots of undesigned coincidences, so-called, but there's other aspects of evidence and scholarship that just is so on all fours against this. It's difficult for me to know where to start, so I need to start somewhere. Which is one thing is that there's a famous contradiction in Mark that is very difficult for people to understand, and yet the natural reading, if you're going to be an inerrantist and read the Bible as it reads, Mark seems to have the feeding of the 5,000 miles away from Bethsaida. Hence, it seems to be in a very desolate place along the coast of it. And afterwards, after the feeding, he says, get into a boat to go to the other side, to Bethsaida. Now, before all kinds of gymnastics start happening, that's the face value reading. If John was actually redacting Mark or taking stuff from Mark, John himself could have thought that in fact the feeding was there, which is not in Bethsaida. And so that's one. There's a number of things about this, really. That's one particular point I'd make. Another is that Philip is a major figure in comparison in John. There's a lot of times he's turning to John and turning to Philip and asking a question. In the Synoptics, he's only mentioned a couple of times next to another disciple, almost insignificant, but he's a character in John, basically. And then in later church history, there's the Acts of Philip. Philip is a big character. So it wouldn't surprise me if Jesus turned to him for anything. So right there, you've got a reason that John could have been turning to Philip. You've got a reason why John could have even thought that it wasn't in Bethsaida. The fact that 3 disciples were from Bethsaida is neither here nor there. They're not related. And more's to the point, Luke does say they withdrew to the town of Bethsaida, which means that why would the disciples in Mark ask, where are they to go? Send them to the surrounding towns and villages. You don't do that if you're in Bethsaida, and if you're just outside it, you still don't do it. So it seems to me that Luke has relocated, or maybe corrected what he thought Mark must have got it wrong. He relocated it. But then the rider on this, to me, and I think I spoke to you before about this, Jonathan, there's another thing like Undesigned Coincidences, but it stands on all fours against the view, and it's called editorial fatigue. And that...
I think you said so much, Sir Andrew.
Can we
take them one by one?
Sure.
Okay.
So what was the first one?
Yeah. So the first one that was brought up was the location of the feeding and the supposed discrepancy between Mark and Luke. And I would want to encourage listeners to read the relevant sources a bit more carefully. So when we go over to Luke chapter 9, verse 10 to 12, this is what we say. We say that they withdrew to a city called Bethsaida. Verse 12 says, now the day was ending, and the 12 came and said to him, send the crowd away, that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside and find lodging and get something to eat, for here we are in a desolate place. And so Bethsaida here, I would argue, is being used in a regional sense. They were not in the city, in the same way that I might say that I live in Boston, even though technically speaking I live in Revere, which is a suburb of Boston. And when we so the question is then, okay, so where was the feeding? Was it at or near Bethsaida? Well, Luke chapter 9 verse 10 says it was a desolate place, and Mark 14 verse 13 also says it was a desolate place. Mark 6 says when it was already quite, so Mark 6 verse 35-36 says, now when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, this place is desolate and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. And so the feeding was near, not at Bethsaida. And so in Mark 6:45, when it says immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent multitudes away. So the Greek term that's used there for to or towards Bethsaida is pros Bethsaidon, which means to or toward or at or by. And so the term pros here in the Greek can mean over against Bethsaida, and that I think and in fact when you read Mark 6:53, this adds further support to this interpretation. It says when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. So Mark has them near Bethsaida, crossing towards Bethsaida, and landing in Gennesaret, which I think harmonizes quite nicely. So I do think that there's a real discrepancy at that point. do you have anything to add to that, or come back on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, because a lot of people who are not inerrantists would just say that that's what you would need to do when Mark could have been plainly wrong. I mean, it's much easier to say you had a theology that really did allow for Mark getting geography wrong, places wrong. And then you could say, well, it wouldn't have been great if it had said in the Greek, go over from here, Bethsaida, to the other place. It would have just settled it right there. But we've got this language that makes it look like, even Ed read it, didn't you, quite naturally? And to you, how did it come across when you read that about the Mark?
Well, I like the NIV. I know, I've forgotten his name now, David Brewer, who's one of the translators. And I've heard him talk about it, and they really do treat their work really seriously. And so their best go at what the Greek means is that the disciples, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. Well, he dismissed the crowd. So they're not saying past Bethsaida or in the direction of Bethsaida or anything like, but to Bethsaida.
Yeah, as if it was somewhere else, you mean? Yeah.
And so I've always got it just always makes alarm bells go for me when somebody says, oh, of course the Greek says this. Yeah. And then you look up what all the English translations give, and there's almost never there, or not in the consensus of what the modern translations are all doing.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there is a basis from reading the context in Mark chapter 6 that pros Bethsaida should be rendered as towards Bethsaida rather than landing in Bethsaida. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, if you look at Mark 6:53, it says when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And and as I showed, Mark has them in proximity to Bethsaida, and then they cross in the direction of Bethsaida, which comports with the geography. If you look at the map, it's in the direction of Bethsaida, and then lands in Gennesaret. And so,
well, that's not. I don't think it does.
Yeah, well, this is what I think. This is what Andrew was.
When you look at the map to go towards Bethsaida, you're going in the opposite direction. Now, in that story, there's some funny business that happens with Jesus walking on the water, the storm, and everything else. And I mean, other people have said, well, the reason they ended up where they said was because of that whole incident. They ended up in a different place. Yeah,
that's my natural reading. That's what I thought.
Yeah, was that it was all. This is where I want you to go, but they ended up coming here because of all this other thing that happened in the meantime. That seems to be what Mark was saying, as I naturally read it. And so,
so assuming they knew what Mark knows the geography, he's not making a mistake on the geography. I'd read it that Bethesda is on the Jordan, just near the Jordan, where it comes down into the lake. So it's right at the top of the lake on the northeast side. Yeah. So they're down the coast a bit in a wilderness area, and they're surrounded by villages, not by a town. Then they get in the boat and go towards, and intending to go to Bethsaida as instructed. Yep. But then the wind blows and they get blown out into the lake, and end up at Gennesaret, which is on the opposite side. That's how I read it. Yeah, yeah. That's what Mark is trying to say.
And Luke then relocates it, because if, again, all that weight of scholarship in biblical studies, there are so many scholars that just believe in looking at the text that Luke does relocate things and resituate things. It's perfect for Luke to go, well, I'm putting it here because maybe Mark got it wrong. The story I've got, I'm changing the location, as he does in many other places,
Well, let's give Jonathan a turn on this.
Okay.
So just a couple of questions on that. First of all, how do you interpret Mark 6:53, which says they landed in Gennesaret? If it's Mark's intent to convey that they went to land in Bethsaida, how do you interpret Mark 6:53?
That they got blown off course, basically.
Yeah. Through the kerfuffle of what was happening, it was a whole lot that goes on. He didn't just say, and when they crossed, as if that's what... Because you're basically saying, Jonathan, that basically Mark, even though he doesn't say it in a way that we would like, Mark was basically saying, leave from Bethsaida and go over there.
Well, nearby. It's still a boat journey from where the feeding took place up to Bethsaida.
Well, no. Jonathan is not saying.
Sorry. I think
Jonathan is saying somehow they're going to. I find it difficult to how they can go towards Bethsaida and keep going in the same direction and end up across the lake, assuming where this nearby beach or location was. So to me, it seems strikingly like something funny is going on in the whole story with Mark. Anyway, but
okay, so that's a possible reading that they were blown off course. Mark doesn't actually say explicitly that they were blown. That's the reason for landing in Gennesaret. It seems to imply that that's where they were headed. But in any case, Mark does suggest that they were not that they were in a desolate place close to Bethsaida. That they were in proximity to Bethsaida. So I don't think Mark or Luke are telling us that the event was situated in the actual city of Bethsaida, but rather was in proximity to Bethsaida.
No, but Mark could be on the west coast even, because to head right across, if you take from, say, the bottom of the lake, just for example, I was reading one scholarly thing that I downloaded and paid for on this, and they were saying that, taking Mark alone, that your picture could be, in fact, it was quite down south on the west, and that they were heading up to right across the lake to get to Bethsaida. So it could have been absolutely nowhere near Bethsaida, in relation to how near you are saying it is.
But Mark does indicate in Mark chapter 6 verse 35 that it was a desolate place, and the people are told that the disciples say to Jesus to send the people away so they can go into the surrounding countryside villages and buy them something to eat. So that indicates, which comports with Luke, that there was a desolate place, right?
Well, yes and no, because I haven't got on to Luke yet. But yes, in other words, it's so far away from anywhere, there's no indication that Bethsaida was your local shopping place. It's all the villages and towns. Send them away. You're so far away that, in fact, you've got to send them to different villages. Otherwise, the most natural meaning of the text, in your view, would be, Philip, you live with Bethsaida. Where are the best shops? Okay, but it's not like that. It's like, we have to send them to all the surrounding villages. This means you are so desolate. As a matter of fact, desolate is related to the word wilderness. And Luke actually starts off by saying, if he is relocating, there's a whole other reason for this from Mark Goodacre's point of view, for example. He's relocating it in Bethsaida itself, not even outside, at that phrase in that text at the beginning of Luke 9.
Yeah, so what's the problem with taking Bethsaida in a regional sense? I don't understand why we can't, in the same way that I might say that I live in Boston, which I often do say, even though technically speaking I live in a suburb of Boston, which is called Revere. I don't see a problem with that. The other point I want to make before we come back is also on the issue of the mountain contradiction, because you did bring that up. And this also came up in Richard Carrier's recent article where he talks about undesigned coincidences and is very critical of that argument. And I wrote a 6-part series of articles, I think, dismantling Carrier's objections. And
we need the links to this.
Sure, I'll send you the links later.
Okay, so we'll put them in the notes.
Yeah. Okay, so Mark doesn't say that the event didn't take place on the mountainside. In fact, you can look up the text for yourself and see there's no denial of the fact that the event took place on the mountainside. And John states in John chapter 6 verse 3 that they went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. And we're not told how high in the mountainside Jesus and the disciples went. Mark simply indicates that the event took place in a desolate place. So in agreement with John, Mark indicates that there was a mountain in the vicinity, since Jesus dismisses the crowds, and then he went up on the mountain to pray, Mark 6:46. Also the Greek uses the definite article there, to oros, meaning the mountain, which might be taken to suggest that the events took place on, or at least in vicinity of a mountainside. So I don't really see a contradiction there either.
Oh, I see that after Mark is then when the mountain comes in view where Jesus goes to, not that it was already on it happening. In John, it seems pretty clear it's all happening on the mountain. Mark seems to go to a mountain afterwards. So I just see that this is almost like very sort of old style harmonization, as if it's like 2 video cameras on the situation, as opposed to any relationship between copying. Which would...
What would be the motivation to insert that it was taking place on the mountain? Why would there be a theological motivation for inserting that?
Oh, because this is the thing I was alluding to. That so much in gospel studies and thematic it has gone the direction that each gospel is saying its own thing, and this comes back to that point which you disagreed with. That I feel that the whole premise of this is like you've got 4 video cameras. One's a wide shot, one's a close up, and they're all independent cameras. They're filming the one incident, and each particular angle gives a nice interlocking with another angle. And that is 100% opposite to where scholarship has got in how the Gospels relate, because it's literally copying and redacting sources and changing things and adapting it. And therefore, once you've got that going on, you really need to dismantle that before you can then start anything interlocking. So the mounting could be a common theme with John, as the word immediately is in Mark. Immediately this, immediately Jesus did this, immediately that. These are common particular themes that pop up in different people's styles. So to suddenly get rid of all of that and just say, well, here's where the mountain was, and this is where they, it seems to me that they're not concerned as writers that this happened in these exact ways, that they're taking the essence and then they're sort of shaping it in another way. And then if you accept that, even as a Christian, you've got no problem. Of course, different locations don't mean a thing. But it does for those that want to see it like a video. So that's what I'd say to that.
Where does Mark say that the event did not take place on a mountainside? We agree
I've got that. I've got it in front of me now. I was just looking at it again.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jesus went across the lake to a solitary place. Verse 33 of Mark 6. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Jesus landed and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So it's not like he led them up a mountain.
But it doesn't deny that, does it?
Yeah, but that's
well,
that. Sorry.
It sounded like he did it straight away.
Yeah.
When Jesus landed, it's all like he had compassion on them. So he began teaching them. So it's all exactly, it's all took place on the lakeshore. That seemed to be
my natural
very
reading,
clear what Mark's saying.
Yeah, with Mark, it naturally took place on the shore. Luke it seems to be in the town of Bethsaida, and John, it seems to be up a mountain. They're the natural, and once you can get artistic and say these are the artistic elements of writers, it's no problem. But it's once you try to get it to be the exact same historical angle, you then have to say, and I know what you're saying there, Jonathan, because that is a particular style of argumentation. If it doesn't say the actual opposite in words, then we can fit it in, So it's on the lakeshore, and I know, Jonathan, you'll probably say, well, it's on the lakeshore because you go up the mountain just from there, and John is telling you that's what they did, But is that what you would say?
Yeah, so John says in John 6:3 that Jesus went up on the mountain and there he sat down with his disciples. It doesn't say how high on the mountainside Jesus and the disciples went, does it?
No, but that's, again, I think what's happening here is more of a rationalistic assumption of literature. And like I said, this is why it's in one sentence, because you speak like that. If you sat in the room full of Dale Allisons and the N.T. Wrights and all these people in the world and sat and said that, you would probably get a lot of pushback from most of them to say this is not how the artistic study goes of writers who are doing their own thing, their own stories for their own reasons. They're not giving you a video camera angle by saying, well, it doesn't say the opposite,
Well, I think it does, because in John, Jesus gets there first. In Mark, the crowd get there first and Jesus lands. In John, Jesus gets there first and they're all following him.
Yeah.
So when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, so that's why he's sort of gone up the mountain first, maybe to make a good amphitheatre for his teaching or something like that. That's what I get as a natural reading of John.
Right, and it doesn't say in John that they went right to the top of the mountain. It says they went up.
No. I'm not.
No, but that's what I mean. The fact is, I know that this thing happens with sort of other apologists. If it did say he went to the top, you can bet your bottom dollar no one is going to say, "Wow, obviously one of them's got their eyewitness testimony wrong." No, you would get some amazing scenario in which that could happen. That's the temptation. The temptation is to say, by theology alone, there cannot be contradiction, and therefore, or difference, or artistic license, or relocating. By that alone means that you have to then say something that does sound strained to the outsider. And
but that doesn't apply to me, because there are examples where I think there are contradictions or legitimate discrepancies. I just don't think this is an example of it.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I would say that this is definitely one.
I don't think I'm an advocate of harmonization of historical documents in general, not just the Bible, especially in documents which show themselves to have the high level of substantial reliability that we see with the gospel accounts.
Yeah. Francis, do you want to come in on a thing on this?
Oh God! Well, I'm confused. I'm just confused, to be honest.
I suppose any listener might be confused.
Well, if you're confused, then that's a canary in the cage saying we're not doing a good podcast.
I think it works best for you because the three of you have such intimate knowledge of the various Gospels, and I'm trying to follow, having the various Gospels open on, on my browser and switching between the two of them. But I'm finding it quite hard to follow all the minutiae of, where Bethsaida was and where the lake was. I mean, I've, perhaps just to give a bit of a background to this. I think I first heard this argument from Undesigned Coincidences when somebody, I mean, it could have been you, Jonathan, for all I know, when I was listening to one of the Unbelievable conference recordings, and somebody gave this example of Philip and, why would Jesus turn to Philip? And, when I was listening to it, I did think I thought, well, that is a good argument, actually. But I mean, since then, I think perhaps there are things that have caused me to think maybe it isn't such a good argument. And I don't know whether I can ask at this stage. And if you don't, if you don't want this question to come at this stage, we can either cut it out in the editing, or you can just say, well, we'll sort of put that on the back burner for now. But I just wondered, Jonathan, why do you think that this Undesigned Coincidences have fallen out of favour in recent times as a means of apologetics?
Yeah, I think it's more of a forgotten argument than one that's fallen out of favour for good academic reasons. Certainly, there are quite a number of academics that endorsed Lydia's book. I can give a few examples. At the beginning of the book, there are a number of endorsements from high-profile scholars, including Dr. Craig Blomberg, Gary Habermas, Paul Meyer, Craig Keener, Craig Evans, Darrell Bach, Paula Rose Eddy, C. John Collins, Robert Bowman, John Warwick Montgomery. So it's not that scholars are rejecting this argument. And the scholar, I haven't seen a lot of interaction with his argument from critics in the scholarly academic literature. So it seems to me that it's not an argument that's been reviewed in the academic literature and found wanting. It's an argument that has simply been forgotten with the passage of time. Now there are some critics, as you're familiar, such as Richard Carrier, who've made objections to undesigned coincidences, and the reasons that they offer for rejecting this argument, I think, need to be addressed. One of them, as has already been brought up in this discussion, is the literary relationship between the Gospels. And Richard Carrier falsely asserts that scholars, the consensus of scholarship is that John used the synoptics as sources. That's just simply not true. It's highly debated in scholarship. I personally think that John probably did use the synoptics as sources, but it's certainly not the consensus that Carrier represents it as. The other point that is often brought up is the so-called source theory, which can come with a couple of different manifestations. So basically, the objection that's raised is that the undesigned coincidences could just as well be explained by the gospel authors incompletely remembering the oral tradition or incompletely copying from a common earth source that contained both parts of the coincidence. Now, just in brief, I'm happy to unpack it more later if people want it, but there's no independent evidence for such an earth source, either in terms of the documentary evidence or written testimony to its existence, and so it's therefore ad hoc. It's invoked simply for the purpose of avoiding the most obvious explanation that the gospel documents are grounded in true history. The oral tradition alternative, I think, is a slightly better scenario, given that there is evidence, I think, for the existence of oral tradition concerning the life of Jesus, but it has its own problems, which would also apply to the earth source hypothesis as well. For example, there's no evidence for the type of oral tradition of gospel stories that would be needed to explain most examples of undesigned coincidences. So, for example, take the instance that we've just been discussing with the involvement of Philip in the account of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6, verse 5, which is explained by Philip sometime being Bethsaida. So it seems it seems very unlikely to me that Christians across geographical areas would have known, as part of the oral tradition, the hometown of Philip as being in Bethsaida. And in fact, that assumption would lead us to conclude that virtually any randomly selected adult Christian residing in Pisidian Antioch could have listed the hometowns of Bartholomew and Judas, not Iscariot, and every other member of the 12. On that scenario, it appears that one would have to suggest that almost any detailed piece of information contained in the Gospels was widely known in the Christian community and widely known extremely early, before the Gospels were even written, and that seems to me to be very unlikely. I have other problems with the oral tradition scenario, but I'll turn it back to you guys.
Yeah,
I want to step back a little bit before we go back to the detail.
Yeah.
I was going to go into Bayes, but I think we're going to run out of time if we go into that. But basically, you could say we've got our list of if you counter us as sort of hard and skeptical naysayers, we've got our list of contradictions, and you've got your list of undesigned coincidences. And when we mention what appears to us to be a contradiction or a discrepancy, say the location of the feeding of the 5,000, you get your kind of critical faculties in gear and explain. This is Jonathan, and you explain how no, it can all be harmonised, or it is in harmony. If you just change the if you reinterpret the meaning of the Greek here and allow for this there or this, that, and the other. Is it equally valid for us to just say, well, here's a list of ways that I could reconcile and accommodate these undesigned coincidences, and it all becomes a sort of kind of score draw?
I think that there's a degree of epistemic asymmetry at that point, in the sense that there are many ancient sources which are thought to be reliable, which contain discrepancies and contradictions, and so even if you can demonstrate contradictions in the Gospels, and I personally think there are a handful of contradictions which I don't think there are any good harmonizations for. I'm happy to list those if you want. But I don't think it undermines the case for the substantial reliability of the Gospels, given that they demonstrate themselves to be substantially reliable and based on eyewitness testimony. And the few examples I think there are of discrepancies between the Gospel accounts are cases which can be accounted for quite readily by good faith mistakes rather than deliberate distortions of fact. On principle of harmonization, I think it's a legitimate practice in historiography to harmonize accounts. I don't just do this with the New Testament, but I would do it with other ancient sources as well, where there are discrepancies. I would always appeal to error as the last resort, especially for sources which show themselves in every other respect to be substantially reliable, and furthermore, I've been through essentially every example of a contradiction that Bart Ehrman discusses in his books, in particular his book Jesus Interrupted, which talks about contradictions in detail. There's a whole chapter called A World of Contradictions, where he talks about alleged contradictions in the gospel accounts and indeed the book of Acts. I find that well over 90% of those examples disintegrate as soon as you actually read the text for yourself. So I think that given that the gospel authors show themselves to be close up to the facts, that they have reliable access to information, and they're substantially trustworthy, I think that provides grounds to give them the benefit of the doubt, even when there are apparent discrepancies, especially when there are plausible harmonizations of how those accounts fit together.
To put this in a bit of context for our discussion, we've had this sort of to and fro on the different locations for the feeding of the 5,000. Would you put that into the category of, well, when you look at the text, it melts away pretty quickly?
The examples you gave in regards to the location of the feeding of the 5,000 in the mountain, etc.
Yeah, mountain, lakeshore, in the town of Bethsaida, or out in.
I don't think that these are good contradictions now.
What I could say to that is I think the problem here is, I mean, I had the opposite journey when I used to sort of argue like you, Jonathan, and then read more widely, and some of the scholarly reasons for the perceived contradictions. I mean, you have evangelical books, massive encyclopedia. One's called the Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. That you wouldn't have an evangelical writing that unless people were getting the impression there's lots of difficulties when naturally reading. And so, but a lot of
is it a 40-page leaflet?
No way. It's somebody's 30 years life work. I forget the name of the scholar now, but evangelical, almost quite fundamentalist. But at least he's admitting the Bible is chock full of apparent contradictions. So it wasn't like God could have said, well, I'm going to make a book that doesn't read like it's got contradictions. It certainly does. But I found that some of the answers were fantastic in the more liberal theology of Christians, which was basically talking about themes, redactions. You know, the flood story has two versions welded together. That's why you get all the differences. It makes perfect sense. Two different writers, two traditions. And all of these answers don't sit well with a fundamentalist understanding of the Bible, but they do sit well in terms of how literature and other literature outside the Bible was written and how people did stuff. And so I feel at the bottom of Undesigned Coincidences, when you give an example of an interlocking thing, to you, that goes, the veracity of an eyewitness account. To me, it's a slap in the face insult to hundreds and hundreds of scholars who haven't gone that route through their life study evidences of literature, themes, thematic changes, things that they're doing to the literature that's right in front of them. And everything is like, that's why Lydia had to say, let's set aside scholarship. You have to, because if you engage with it, it stands on all fours against this approach. And that's why I mentioned the other scholarly view of text, which is that whole thing, which is accepted by a lot of scholars as quite persuasive, called editorial fatigue. And that plays right into the feeding of the 5,000 in Luke. And are
you familiar with this one, Jonathan?
Yes, I am. I'm familiar with Richard Goodacre's thesis. I'm not persuaded by it. I actually don't think... I'm not very impressed with the editorial fatigue hypothesis, and I'm happy to go into examples if you want. But
well, I'll go into it on Luke, because that's when I first heard about the feeding of 5,000 being an undesigned coincidence. I'd already got to the place where I had seen this was a really good example of an absolute opposing view in scholarship. Except this time, it is accepted by Bart Ehrman and all these other scholars. As a matter of fact, on Bart Ehrman's blog, Mark Goodacre comes on to talk about it. And it is accepted in scholarly circles, as opposed to undesigned coincidence is not at all at that level.
Explain what's going on.
Okay, right.
Somebody.
I'll explain. So we've had the term undesigned coincidence. That's one thing. We've had that explained. Editorial fatigue is a scholarly view that's not from Mark Goodacre. He's just sort of made it more nuanced and detailed. But it's the view that rather than the Gospels being totally independent, Matthew and Luke copy from Mark. Let's just stick with that. They make changes. They copy word for word in Greek over, but they also do their stylistic changes. They relocate settings and scenes in different places, but with the same Greek copying of chunks of literature across. One of the great things about this is that Mark Goodacre uses the feeding of the 5,000 to give a top view of this example. And so he says, Luke relocates from Mark's setting the feeding of the 5,000 and puts it in the city of Bethsaida. not even outside, locally in that sort of way Jonathan was talking, but literally at the beginning. But in this apparently happens when people copy all sorts of works, that if you're copying, but you also change something, you might knock out the consistency of your copying. So in setting it in Bethsaida, he then copies in Greek verbatim, basically, the disciples' question, go out to all the towns and the villages, which is a strange thing to say if Luke had just put him in Bethsaida, even near Bethsaida, because near Bethsaida is where you'd go. You wouldn't go to all the towns and villages. So what's happening here is that Luke is relocated it, set it there, and then in the copying of the story of Mark, he copies verbatim something that doesn't quite fit and work. Okay, and so then when you get down to the towns and villages, you see that there's a puzzle, and you go, well, how come they were in the town and now Jesus is sending, in this deserted place in the wilderness, go to any of these villages nearby? It makes perfect sense to me, perfect sense that he's copying, and there's lots of examples of this that Mark Goodacre gives, where something doesn't make sense in Luke, and it's that way round only, or Matthew, but it's never the other way around. It's never from Mark fatiguing from the others. So the argument is, not only is it a strong evidence that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, it adds to all the other reasons why Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, and that's why it's the dominant view anyway. And to me, it was like, wow, this is incredible. But when I heard of the undesigned coincidence, I thought, well, that they are opposed to each other. They are scholarly views. One's an old one that died away, and one's a relatively new one. To me, the fatigue is absolutely, that's the argument I'd be using, Jonathan, if you were to do this, is to say, yeah, this is what happened in Luke 9. It's what you call gospel fatigue in copying. So that would be, Francis, do you understand the point I'm making there?
And yes, I do understand about the fatigue issue. I read the Mark Goodacre link, which I think it was Ed. Oh, you sent it.
Ed, one of us sent
it.
Yeah.
Okay, and I thought that was very interesting, and I found it persuasive. But then I don't know what the contrary arguments are. But it does, to me, make sense that it is very easy to slip into forgetting to keep your story straight.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of, if anybody's read Pincher Martin, it's the sort of Pincher Martin error that you can't always keep a story straight in your mind, and you will introduce errors, or you'll forget what the puzzles. Background is. Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, that's basically the idea that the later gospel writers decided to put something different into Mark, which they were basically using, and then they kind of forgot, and then they put something straight out of Mark without remembering that it kind of knocked out their earlier adaptation and made nonsense of their earlier adaptation. I found that persuasive.
Yeah.
That's well, you asked, Francis, you asked for some pushback, so let's get it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Jonathan?
Yeah. So on that scenario, why wouldn't a simpler and easier explanation simply be that that Luke is using the term Bethsaida in a more regional sense rather than a rigid sense? I don't see why that would be a less preferable scenario.
Because that's trying to look at it in that sort of harmonization, literalistic two-camera view that I was saying, different angles, rather than already building upon the scholarship of gospel fatigue didn't come from out of the blue. It wasn't at J.J. Blunt's time before this had all got going on, or even Paley. This is much more recent argument based on the fact that all the accumulative evidence is so strong for most scholars that Mark was simply the earliest and the others did copy. Once you accept that, it's going to be, I think Mark Goodacre and I think it was Golding was the people that were saying, the best way to deal with these differences and puzzles comes from the fact that you can actually notify it in other parts of the Bible, but in also common literature. People do this all the time. And it makes perfect sense that the most natural thing is that because what you're implicitly doing is Jonathan, I think, is that you're trying to not tell the audience that Mark did copy chunks of Greek word for word verbatim Matthew from Mark. And your case would be so much more stronger if they had no relationship whatsoever. that they didn't even hear of each other. They were just narrating their oral traditions. And then you have to say that they clearly haven't got anything wrong in passing down stories. That's another issue. I think all the stories could be adapted and changed anyway before you even get to Mark. But to me, the most obvious thing is that, if he's copying verbatim Greek, like going to the towns around about, that to me is the obvious answer, is that he's relocated it, but then he's lost the thread of where this would go if he copies verbatim bits down in Greek.
I would see this example as an instance of what I call reconcilable variation, which is where you have a feature of two different accounts, which at first blush appears to be a discrepancy, but then upon further reading, acquiring further information, it turns out to harmonize quite well without any forcing after all. So, for instance, Luke mentions that the event takes place in a city called Bethsaida. That's verse 22.
Right.
Yep. And Luke 9 verse 12 says, and the day began to draw in, and the 12, having approached him, said, "Send away the crowd, so that we go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and find provisions, because we are here in a desert place."
Yeah.
And the fact that they're in a desert place, I think the simplest way of understanding that is that that Luke is using the term Bethsaida in a more loose sense, in the same way that I might talk about how I live in Boston, even though technically I live in Revere, which is a suburb of Boston. And people use that sort of language and these sorts of expressions all the time. So I don't see why that is that's a less preferable scenario.
Because you're still operating, even though you've admitted that Matthew did copy from Mark, you're still operating as if they didn't. It's got nothing to do with any kind of copying.
But can they not have access to their own independent sources of information?
But when you're copying the Greek question over, it's fine if Luke had said something like, they withdrew to a city of Bethsaida. It didn't say near. It didn't say near to be a desolate wilderness place in which you go to all kinds of villages. If they were near Bethsaida, as you say, he would turn to Philip, in your argument, and say, what are the best shops in the city or the town to buy stuff? Not the question from the disciples going round. So therefore it seems to me,
I've got the Greek in front of me here if you're interested.
Okay, good. It seems to me that he's following the narrative he's copying, but he's relocated, but the narrative he's copying actually will cause a tension between this wilderness place and the question, which is pretty close to Mark's, and the relocating.
So he said Luke 9:10 in my interlinear Greek. So I'll do the English interlinear first. He withdrew by himself into a town, that's Polin, called Bethsaida. So it's not a region, and it's a town, and it's the town, not
yes,
it's
or
not
the city in some.
I think it's into.
Yeah.
So the into verb word is ice.
East. Yeah.
It's a preposition. I don't know much about that. A town is Polin, and then that's that.
Yeah. The into word is east. Let me ask you a question. Did we not speak in that sort of looser sense with regards to geography today? Would it not, like, for instance, I used to live in Tynemouth, which is a suburb of Newcastle, and I might tell someone when I was traveling that I live in Newcastle, even though technically I live in Tynemouth. Would that not be a legitimate way of speaking? And could we not say that a simpler explanation for the gospel authors that they're speaking in a more loose sense in regards to geography?
Not if friends of yours said, where can we go in all the different places and towns and cities away from here, because this is a very desolate place. That they would be already, if that was true of what you're saying, they would be focusing back on the actual town you're near. There's no hint at all that this couldn't be miles away, like Mark, in fact, seems to indicate by being miles away the other side of the lake from Bethsaida. So it's perfect. Mark is very consistent. He's in a very, very desolate place that they need to go different directions to different villages. It's got nothing to do with the Bethsaida shops. And so to me, it doesn't work. It works far better that he's just lifted Mark's setting and actually not equated, because if you were to interview the writer of Luke now, and he told you, I was copying Mark, and of course I put them in the city, of course there's going to be this problem. And you would probably be quite shocked. But that's what he could have done. We can't get into the mind of Luke, but it seems to me I believe that's what Luke did. Yeah.
If it's a town, if you say you go to Newcastle, go to a town called Newcastle, and you're on the edge of Newcastle, that's absolutely fine. But if you were living in a farmhouse where all the surrounding villages weren't Newcastle, to say I live in a town called Newcastle really would not be accurate.
Yeah, if you're talking about Leeds or something. Yeah, if you're in a country place, all those villages and towns that the disciples asked to go to have no relationship, being one of them to be Bethsaida. And remember, it's only John that Jesus actually asked the question in John. The disciples in Mark asked the question, not Jesus. So there's an issue there. Jesus says, where are we going to buy bread? But that's not, the disciples asked the question in Luke, because he copies from Mark and Matthew for that matter. But John has Jesus suddenly ask the question, which is very different. You'll probably try to put them together because a mindset of harmonization will say, well, it doesn't say he didn't ask the question. But they're both doing and writing different things. They're adapting it as a source to their own ends,
Yeah, I just reiterate what I said earlier. I don't think you've repeated that. I think it's the most probable and most simplest, the simplest explanation is that Luke didn't obviously see any discrepancy between saying that they were in Bethsaida and in fact they were in a desolate place, which is in proximity to Bethsaida. And I don't see any problem with
okay.
Surrounding. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wanting to move on from this anyway to the biggest elephant in the room on this. Yeah, the biggest elephant in the room. This is what I was talking to John, who was going to be with us, but I had to talk about this because he did his thesis on the feeding of the 5,000. But I mean, the biggest elephant in the room for anyone listening to this who's actually managed to stay trying to follow us, is in fact that what you're saying, Jonathan, is that in fact this interlocking thing that seems so obvious actually validates bread and fish multiplying supernaturally. Is that where you're going with this? That in fact,
no. So the undesigned coincidence is only relevant to the interlocking components of those sources. It doesn't necessarily show that other things in the same source are reliable. However, however, the argument is that there's a cumulative argument from dozens of examples throughout the Gospels and indeed the Book of Acts. It shows that the Gospels are substantially trustworthy and that they're close up to the facts and have reliable access to information.
So you meaning, yes, ultimately undesigned coincidences lead to the fact that bread can multiply and fish can multiply to feed thousands and thousands of people, basically.
It points to them being substantially reliable and based on eyewitness testimony, yes.
Right, whereas I think that the scholarship in terms of copying and redacting, Mark could have just been a fictional story, remember there's a feeding of the 4,000 as well, and in Mark, and they asked the same question, which I found bizarre. In the feeding of the 4,000, 2 chapters later, the same situation basically happens. And what do they say to Jesus? What I would say is, Jesus, just like you fed the 5,000, why don't you do that miracle again and do the fish and the bread? Here's 7 of them. But no, they say, where can we buy bread? How do we feed these people? It's a shock. Now, that's fiction. That's brilliant. It's just Mark combining 2 different traditions together and making his point for something else. But for historical reliability, I think that question of the 4,000 really throws a spanner into the question of this historical aspect of it.
Yeah, and in the Mark 8 scenario, I would see them asking a rhetorical question at that point.
Who is?
The disciples.
What? You mean they really knew what he could do? Right, I see. Okay. Well, I'd leave Ed and Francis to think about that one.
I'm sorry, I missed what Jonathan said.
Oh, I was saying that I think in Mark chapter 8, they're probably asking a rhetorical question.
Okay. Yeah.
And why couldn't it be rhetorical in the 5,000?
Well, it just contextually, since he already fed them in that way in Mark chapter 6, it seems that when they ask him in Mark chapter 8, they're asking rhetorical questions. So in Mark chapter...
I would say it would never have occurred to me that would be the case, because you're putting... Mark already has a theme of unintelligent disciples all the way through, compared with Matthew and Luke, which comes from a lot of scholarship. And so the disciples are perfectly thick a lot of the time. So to suddenly ask a rhetorical question really goes against that theme. But I'll leave Francis Ned to think about that one, if you know what I mean by that point that I made.
Yeah, I do understand. I mean, I suppose one of the observations I would make is that Philip doesn't respond by showcasing his great local expertise. He just starts wittering on about the cost. So I wonder if that is, I just wonder how well that fits in with the coincidence that you've identified, Jonathan.
I'm not sure where you're going with that.
Well, I mean, you say that Jesus turns to Philip because Philip's a local, but when Philip answers, he doesn't showcase his local knowledge. He more talks about the cost rather than,
You mean in?
Sorry, this is in John.
John.
Yeah. So
when he says, okay. So he says, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. I don't see how that undermines the coincidence.
Okay.
I see what, Francis, you're saying, though. You're saying that he's not really addressing it as like a local guy. He's just doing it.
Yeah,
he's
giving the same answer that any of the disciples would have given.
John may have not even known it was in Bethsaida. If he was just looking at Mark and not Luke, he would have thought it was in this desolated place. And so turning to Philip is quite normal because he's a common character in John. And it's a perfectly reasonable, Francis, for him to talk about the money in that case.
Yeah, but the motivation for Jesus turning to Philip, I would argue, is because of his habitation in Bethsaida, as it being his hometown. It doesn't need to bring that up in the reply. He says he's just simply saying 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. And then Andrew's also involved in the reply, and you see the casualness with which Philip and Andrew are introduced in this account, which I think, given the wider context of the event being in Bethsaida from Luke and Philip and Andrew both being from Bethsaida, I think has a hallmark of verisimilitude. Back just briefly to the point about Mark chapter 8 and the feeding of the 4,000. Another scenario that you could also postulate is, because I mean the disciples doesn't necessarily always refer to the 12, and so you could also interpret disciples there as referring to as someone from a wider community of disciples than merely the 12 at that point as well. So that's another way you could look at that.
Right. Yeah. So I think again this is just all hinting at the fact that rather than evidence coming your way and then you go by where the evidence goes, it seems to me that the evidence really can only be filtered through certain filters. And maybe we all do this, but that filter is basically, if it's possible to non-contradict and it's historical, let's get there somehow, as opposed to they're just writing and copying and adapting and changing, and they don't have the concerns that you have as writers. There's a big difference there.
I think that harmonization is a good practice in historical research generally, not just for the Gospels, especially in cases where you have where the authors have a good track record of being historically reliable, such as we have with the Gospels and Acts. And so I think I would be inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, even on cases which at first blush appear to be a discrepancy. I don't think I would rush to infer a discrepancy, but rather I would give them the benefit of the doubt until it's been demonstrated that, in fact, they cannot be harmonized.
Right, because again, though, wouldn't you need to then say ahead of that to someone, the reason that I do this as a harmonization project is because we're talking about a video camera reality, that if you came out in Doctor Who's TARDIS, we would see this here, that there, in this order. And that then completely writes off anybody trying to think about relocating. The cleansing of the temple is a classic one, isn't it? It's at the beginning in John, it's at the end in the Synoptics. I'm going to guess here, because I don't know, I'm going to guess you're going to say there might be 2 cleansings.
Yeah, I think there were 2 cleansings.
Right, I thought you would, because you see, I can see where your mind is coming from. Whereas actually, the majority of scholarship by a long shot says that John is simply relocating it and changing it for his own theological reasons, and that there was only one.
What's interesting, though, about that example is that, notice that prompts the Jews to ask Jesus, what sign did you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered, destroy the temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up. And in verse 20, the Jews then said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and we'll raise it up in 3 days. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he'd said this, and they believed the scripture and the word Jesus spoke. And notice that they say it's taken us 46 years to build this temple, which is a very casual reference, but it gives us a timestamp of when this event is supposed to have taken place. When we go over to Luke's, when's 46 years from the commence of the building of the temple? Well, Herod the Great began work on the temple according to Josephus in the 18th year of his reign, which falls in about 19 BC. 46 years on from that lands you in 28 AD. When you go over to Luke chapter 3, we learn when Jesus began his public ministry, which is the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now we know from Suetonius that Tiberius became co-emperor with Augustus in around 12 AD, 2 years before Augustus' death. So the 15th year on from that would land you in 27 AD. And the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2 is taking place the following Passover, which would be 28 AD. So they have two independent ways of calculating the date at which the cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2 took place. And so I think that that supports that Jesus cleansed the temple towards the beginning of his public ministry, and I don't see a problem with positing that he also cleansed at the end of the ministry as well.
Well, I think that you would probably have to go there based on the consistency of everything must be in order and working in this 4-camera view rather than artistic license and changing stuff. I know that in scholarship for sure, they say that in the Gospels alone, the synoptics, you only have a 12-month scenario. It's only John that pushes it to 3 years. I'd need to do a lot more research to see if that can be overturned by anything you just said. But John Nelson, by the way, has got some great undesigned coincidences, he said to me anyway, between the cleansing of the temples, meaning that there's a good interlocking undesigned coincidence to show that in fact there's one event going on between John and thing. So that would actually use your argument of undesigned coincidence to show that they were one event.
I'd like to see exactly.
Yeah, I'd like to see that as well. So I said to John, send it on.
We've been talking about undesigned coincidences. We've really only talked about one.
Well, that was the idea, because I thought that there were so many problems with the one.
There are so many things that we've got to deal with that it's best to focus on one particular one. And I think I might be right in thinking, Jonathan, that one is one of your favourites, the feeding of the 5,000, and particularly Philip.
It's one of the easiest to explain in a short time. So it's usually
Well, I think that makes it an excellent one for us to focus on because, as I say, coming at it from an outsider, I mean, I've got all these places in my head all over the other side of the Lake of Galilee, and I'm really finding it quite difficult to work out who was where and when and what that implicated. Yeah.
I mean, my thesis was to pause, Jonathan, in the sense of when we hear you, Jonathan, on the videos, it's like a lot of undesigned coincidences, one after the other, which you haven't got time to process really in that way of doing it. So to pause and say, right, let's look at the one issue from all angles, what other scholars say, themes, biblical scholarship, redaction, how that may impact on that statement, rather than just the next one and the next one and the next one, because it's almost assuming there isn't any of these things to ask. It's just like, wow, that's great. And so I wanted to pause it in the nicest possible way and critique it. And
I'm actually intent on developing a presentation where I review the objections to undesigned coincidences.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah. Good. So you could say,
that'd be interesting.
That would be great. And to have a presentation on that would put people in the situation on talking about them in the first place. Yeah.
Well, I think it's probably time to wind up now. It's been absolutely tremendous. And Jonathan, particularly, thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us and explaining this, and being so gracious with having three of us firing different stuff at you, and being the lone defender, as it were. So thank you. It would be great, actually, just for you to say what you like, but include some of the key links you'd like our listeners to be aware of.
Sure. So there's my website, apologetics-academy.org. I'll shortly also be launching my personal website, which will be jonathanmclatchie.com. I also recommend, for more on this topic, Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, as well as her subsequent book, The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And I also suggest reading my 6-part response to Richard Carrier on Undesigned Coincidences, which you can find at answeringmuslims.com.
Excellent. So, Jonathan, thank you. And I think we'll all just say goodbye. You'll hear from us again next month.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks.
It's bye from Ed.
Bye.
Bye.